Ethan Ward believed the lake had a language of its own. In the early mornings, it whispered in ripples against the dock, carrying the scent of pine and the cool freshness of dawn. By afternoon, it spoke in brighter tones, the chatter of birds, the hum of boats in the distance, and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. It was here, on this stretch of shoreline, that Ethan had poured years of work and nearly every dollar he had into building his dream lodge. The structure wasn't just valuable, it was personal. Towering cedar beams supported a wide A-frame, roof that framed the lake in a perfect panoramic view. The decks wrapped around the building, giving every angle a glimpse of the glittering water. Inside, the polished wood floors reflected the sunlight, and a stone fireplace stood proudly at the center of the main hall. Guests often said it felt like the kind of place that should be on a magazine cover. It hadn't been an easy journey to create it. The land had been in rough shape when Ethan first bought it, overgrown, neglected, and far from the picture-perfect retreat it was now. He'd cleared brush by hand, overseen construction personally, and kept meticulous records of every inspection and permit. The lodge was as compliant as it was beautiful, and Ethan intended to keep it that way. For years, the Homeowners Association kept its distance. They handled the walking trails, dock permits, and annual events. Ethan followed their guidelines, attended the occasional meeting, and never once received a complaint. That changed the day Karen Stiles moved in. Karen's arrival was subtle at first, just another neighbor introducing herself at a summer gathering. She was polite, even charming, though her questions about Ethan's shoreline seemed unusually direct. She asked how much land he owned, whether he would consider donating part of it for a planned public dock, and how often he used the lodge. Ethan, not one to mix business with neighborly conversation, simply smiled and explained that the property was fully in use and not for sale or lease. Over the next few months, Ethan began noticing small signs that Karen's interest in his land hadn't faded. She brought it up again at an HOA meeting, framing it as a community improvement idea. She asked about it during casual chats near the mailbox. Once, she even lingered at the edge of his driveway, looking out over the water as if mapping something in her mind. Still, Ethan didn't see a reason to worry. His property rights were clear, and he assumed the association had more pressing matters than acquiring one man's dock space. He focused on his own work, hosting weekend guests, planning upgrades to the lodge, and taking long evening walks by the shoreline with a cup of coffee in hand. That sense of calm would not last. Crisp autumn morning, Ethan loaded his truck for a short business trip. He locked the lodge, checked the security cameras, and set off down the winding road away from the lake. He thought about the repairs he'd finish when he returned, the fireplace he'd light as the weather grew colder, and the quiet satisfaction of owning a piece of the lakefront he had worked so hard for. What he didn't know was that while he was away, the place he had built would be reduced to nothing. Somewhere between the hum of his drive and the quiet of his lodge's empty halls, plans were already in motion, plans that would shake the calm waters of the lake and test Ethan's resolve in ways he had never imagined. For now, though, the only sound was the wind through the pines and the steady rhythm of the tires on the road. Ethan's lodge still stood, bathed in morning light, unaware of the shadow about to fall over it. Ethan had always felt a pull toward home when his trips ended, but this time, that feeling was stronger than ever. The winding road that hugged. The lake's edge was painted with late autumn colors, golden leaves drifting onto the pavement, the air crisp and cool. He rounded the final curve, expecting the familiar view, the cedar roof rising above the trees, the deck catching the sunlight, the lodge standing like a quiet sentinel over the water. Instead, the scene before him felt like a sudden drop in his stomach. The roof was gone. The walls were gone. All that remained was a broken outline of a foundation littered with splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered glass. The dock lay half-submerged, one of its beams dangling loosely into the water. The air still carried the faint scent of fresh-cut timber, as if the destruction had happened only hours ago. Ethan stopped the truck in the middle of the drive and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and shock. His mind fought to connect the image before him with the place he had left behind only days earlier. Slowly, he stepped out of the truck. The crunch of gravel under his boots felt painfully loud in the stillness. He walked toward the ruins, scanning, for some sign that this wasn't what it looked like, that maybe this was an accident, or the wrong property entirely. But the familiar outline of the stone fireplace still stood at the center, charred at the edges, like the lone survivor of a battle. A white notice was taped to one of the remaining support posts. The paper flapped slightly in the breeze. Ethan pulled it free and read the printed words. Structure removed under safety compliance measures. Safety compliance measures. The phrase hit him like a slap. His lodge had passed every inspection, since the day it was built. There had been no warnings, no letters, no requests for repairs. The permits were all in order, every upgrade documented, every change approved. He walked the perimeter, noting heavy tire tracks in the dirt, construction, equipment, judging by the depth and width. Whoever had done this hadn't been subtle. And judging from the freshness of the debris, they hadn't wasted time either. When his phone buzzed in his pocket, he pulled it out with hands that still trembled from the shock. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. Mr. Ward? The voice on the other end was clipped, businesslike. This is Robert from the Homeowners Association Board. I'm calling to inform you that the removal of your structure was conducted under board authorization. Ethan's voice was steady, but his chest felt tight. Authorization for what reason? There were concerns about safety, Robert replied. The board determined immediate action was necessary. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. And you did this without notifying me? There was no time for prolonged discussion, Robert said, his tone cooling. You'll receive further details in the coming weeks. The call ended before Ethan could respond. He stood there for a moment, phone still in hand, staring at the ruins of the lodge. It didn't add up. The board had never shown urgency over anything, not dock permits, not road repairs, not even storm cleanup. And now, without a single warning, they had torn down a fully compliant building worth $2 million. Ethan felt the first flicker of something sharper than shock. It wasn't just loss, it was resolve. He had spent years building this place, and he wasn't about to let a vague notice and a short phone call erase that. As the sun began to sink behind the trees, the broken foundation cast long shadows over the ground. Ethan turned toward his truck, his mind already shifting from disbelief to determination. He would find out exactly who had ordered this, and why. And when he did, they would learn that tearing down his lodge had been the biggest mistake they could make. The next morning, the lake was unusually still. Normally, by sunrise, a few fishing boats dotted the water, their motors buzzing softly across the surface. Today, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the call of a distant loon. Ethan stood on what remained of the deck, his hands resting on the railing beam that now leaned at an awkward angle. He'd barely slept. Images of the demolition played over in his mind like a broken reel. The sound of boards cracking, heavy machinery grinding through his walls. It was all imagined, but it felt painfully real. He knew one thing for certain. If the board had truly acted for safety, they would have been required to document it. And Ethan had documentation of his own, permits, inspection approvals, and years of maintenance records. The first step was finding out exactly who on the board had signed off on the demolition order. He didn't trust phone calls. There were too many ways for people to hide behind vague language. He wanted signatures, names, and dates. By mid-morning, Ethan drove into town. The small HOA office was tucked inside a converted cabin near the main road. The building looked quaint from the outside, but inside it had the sterile neatness of a place run by strict rules: white walls, labeled filing cabinets, and a front desk lined with neatly stacked forms. The receptionist looked up as Ethan entered. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I need copies of the board meeting minutes and any documents related to the demolition of my lodge," Ethan said evenly. She hesitated, fingers hovering over her keyboard. "You'll need to submit a written request. Processing can take up to 30 days. Ethan kept his tone calm. 30 days is too long. My property was destroyed without my consent. I'd like to see the paperwork today." Her polite smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes flickered. Uncertainty, maybe even guilt. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's policy." He nodded. "Once." "Then I'll submit the request in writing." Ethan took the form she handed him, filled it out quickly, and slid it back across the desk. He left without another word, but his mind was already moving to the next step. If the board thought they could stall him with red tape, they were wrong. Outside, he spotted a familiar face. Tom Herrera, a longtime neighbor who had often come to the lodge for coffee and fishing trips. Tom was leaning against his truck, arms folded, watching Ethan approach. "Word travels fast," Tom said quietly. "I heard about the lodge. I'm sorry, man." Ethan studied his expression. "Do you know anything about who ordered it?" Tom glanced toward the office building, then back at Ethan. "I don't have proof, but I've heard Karen's name more than once in the past few weeks. She's been pushing for that lakefront land, talking about building some kind of community center with private rentals. Said your property was in the way." Ethan felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. "And the board just went along with it?" Tom gave a small shrug. "Some of them. Not all. But Karen, she knows how to get people on her side." The conversation stuck with Ethan as he drove back toward the lake. Karen's interest in his shoreline hadn't been casual. It had been calculated, and now, with the lodge gone, the land was more vulnerable than ever. When he reached the property, Ethan walked the perimeter again, this time taking photos of every detail: the broken foundation, the damaged dock, the tire tracks, even the angle of the debris piles. He didn't know yet how he would use this evidence, but he knew he'd need it. As the day ended, the sun painted the water in streaks of orange and gold. Ethan sat on a folding chair near the shoreline, staring at the reflection of the fading light. He thought about the years of work he had poured into the lodge, the guests who had found peace here, and the countless moments of quiet he had shared with the lake. He wasn't going to let this be the end of the story. The following morning, Ethan was already in motion before the sun rose. The night before, he'd gone over every file he kept on the lodge: construction permits, architectural, blueprints, insurance policies, even the environmental studies required when the dock was extended years ago. Every document told the same story. The property was fully compliant, meticulously maintained, and worth far more than most homes in the area. If the HOA claimed safety as their reason, they would need hard evidence to support it. Ethan knew they didn't have any, because it didn't exist. That gave him leverage, but he needed to move strategically. The first stop was the county clerk's office. Unlike the HOA, the county kept thorough records, and most were public by law. After an hour of searching through meeting notes and filed permits, Ethan found something telling. There was no record of a formal demolition order from the county. That meant the board had acted without proper legal channels. The second stop was his attorney's office, James Holbrook, a sharp, methodical man who had helped Ethan navigate a property dispute years earlier. James listened quietly as Ethan laid out the events, flipping through the photos and documents Ethan had brought. "They tore it down without a county order?" James asked, his brow furrowing. "Not a single record," Ethan confirmed. "And they're hiding behind vague safety claims." James leaned back in his chair. That's not just negligence. That's a liability nightmare for them. You have a strong case, but we can make it stronger. We'll request full disclosure from the HOA and their contractors. If they stonewall, we'll subpoena. Ethan nodded. I also want them to know I'm not going to be quiet about this. Not for 1 second. James allowed himself a small smile. If you want pressure, I can draft a notice demanding either full compensation or immediate public disclosure. We'll send it to every board member and make it clear this isn't going away. By the time Ethan left the office, the letter was already in motion. Each board member would receive it by the next afternoon. But Ethan wasn't stopping there. Driving back toward the lake, he made a detour to a place only a few locals knew well, the old spillway. The lake had been man-made decades earlier, and the spillway system was the key to controlling its water levels. Ethan had studied it years ago when extending his dock, and he knew exactly how the mechanics worked. Standing on the concrete edge, he listened to the faint rush of water beneath. The structure was sound, but the control valves were manual. Lowering the water level wasn't complicated, it just required authorization. Authorization that Ethan happened to have thanks to a water management easement tied to his property rights. It was a card he had never considered using before. Now he wondered if it might become the perfect way to remind the board just how much they had underestimated him. By evening, the wind picked up, sending small ripples across the lake's surface. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, now just a portable camp set up inside the shell of his guest house, reviewing the day's progress. The attorney's letter was moving, the evidence was piling up, and the idea of using the water easement was growing more tempting by the hour. He knew the board thrived on control of the properties, the docks, and most importantly, the image of the lake as a pristine, exclusive retreat. What would happen if that image was suddenly threatened? As the light faded outside, Ethan glanced toward the shore. Across the water, several large houses glowed warmly in the dusk, their private docks jutting out into the darkening lake. He could almost picture the panic in those homes if the waterline suddenly receded. He wasn't ready to act just yet. But the board had made the first move, and now it was his turn. The game had begun. The following afternoon, Ethan received confirmation that every board member had signed for the legal notice. He pictured them sitting in their kitchens, reading the carefully worded demand from James Holbrook. The letter was formal but sharp, outlining exactly how their actions lacked legal standing and giving them two clear choices. Compensate Ethan for the full value of the lodge or prepare for an aggressive legal battle that would bring unwanted attention to the lake. Karen, guessed, would not take it quietly. She was the type who saw challenges as personal insults. Ethan didn't have to wait long for proof. Just after lunch, a white SUV rolled up to the edge of his property. Karen stepped out, her expression unreadable behind oversized sunglasses. She didn't bother with greetings. "You think you can scare the board with this letter?" she asked, waving a folded copy in her hand. Ethan remained on the porch steps, arms crossed. "No. I think the facts will scare the board. The letter. Just make sure you've seen them." Karen's mouth twitched, though it wasn't quite a smile. "The lodge was a hazard. We acted for the good of the area." "Then you won't mind showing me the county order authorizing demolition," Ethan replied evenly. Her pause lasted just a little too long. "We followed procedure." "Show me the paperwork," he pressed. Karen's tone hardened. "You'll regret pushing this." She turned on her heel and walked back to her SUV, tires spitting gravel as she left. Ethan watched her go. Her visit had confirmed what he suspected. There was no official authorization, and she knew it. That gave him room to maneuver. That evening, he visited the spillway again. The lake stretched out before him, quiet under the fading sky. The control wheels for the valves were locked, but Ethan still had the keys, tucked away in a drawer back at the guest house. His easement rights gave him authority to adjust the lake level for maintenance or shoreline repairs to his property. He wasn't planning to drain it completely, not yet, but lowering it a couple of feet could make a statement without crossing any lines. It would strand several of the more elaborate docks, including Karen's, leaving them tilted and awkward on dry ground. The next morning, Ethan retrieved the keys and drove to the spillway. The steel wheels groaned as he turned them, slowly opening the valves. Water began rushing through the channels below, spilling into the river system downstream. The lake level wouldn't change immediately, but by the weekend, it would be impossible to ignore. While the water began its slow descent, Ethan focused on the second phase of his plan. He reached out to a local reporter who occasionally covered property disputes and environmental issues. Without giving away too much, Ethan hinted at a story about irregular actions by a governing board and a property owner using legal water rights to protect his shoreline. The reporter's interest was instant. By Friday evening, the changes were visible. Several docks now ended in mud, their support posts sticking out like awkward fence rails. Boat owners grumbled as their crafts sat crooked in the shallows. The hum of gossip spread quickly around the lake, and more than one neighbor drove by Ethan's property, slowing down to get a better look at the man they suspected was behind it. Karen, however, didn't stop. She sped past in her SUV, but Ethan noticed her glancing toward the waterline with a tight, controlled expression. She knew exactly what was happening, and that she couldn't stop it without going through the same legal channels she had ignored when demolishing his lodge. That night, Ethan sat by the water's edge, listening to the distant murmur of voices carrying across the lake. For the first time since the demolition, he felt the balance of power shift ever so slightly in his favor. It was just the beginning. By Saturday morning, the lakefront buzzed with quiet frustration. People weren't shouting, but the clipped conversations and pointed glances across yards told their own story. A handful of fishing boats had been pulled up on shore, their hulls dusty from the drying lake bed. Several neighbors had even begun adjusting their docks to keep them usable, a task that involved a lot of sweat and a fair amount of cursing under breath. Ethan spent the morning repairing a section of fencing near his guest house, pretending not to notice the steady stream of curious cars rolling past. Word had clearly spread. Around noon, a low rumble broke the summer stillness. 3 black SUVs turned onto the gravel road leading to his property. They weren't local sheriff's vehicles. 2, new, 2 polished and lacking the county insignia. Each one bore magnetic door placards reading Special Operations Unit in block letters. Ethan set down his hammer and leaned against the fence post, watching as the convoy stopped in front of his gate. The lead SUV door opened, and out stepped Karen, dressed in a tactical-style jacket, dark sunglasses, and with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Behind her, 6 men in black cargo pants and matching shirts fanned out in formation. They wore utility belts, radios, and dark ball caps, but something about their movements felt wrong, more theatrical than procedural. Karen called out, "Mr. Lawson, we have a warrant to inspect your property for violations related to water tampering and unauthorized construction." Ethan's brow rose slightly. "Issued by whom?" She held up a sheet of paper, the text too small to read from a distance. "By the local enforcement authority." "Which authority?" he asked, stepping closer but keeping the gate closed. Her expression remained composed. "The board has partnered with a special task unit to address threats to the area's resources." That told him everything he needed to know. This was no official law enforcement action. It was theater, staged, to intimidate. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're trespassing, Karen. Unless you've got actual county deputies with you and an order signed by a judge, this is just a very expensive costume party." A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably, but Karen pressed on. "If you refuse inspection, we will note your non-compliance and escalate." Ethan took out his phone and snapped several photos. "Go ahead and escalate. Just be aware you're being recorded and every picture will go straight to my attorney and the county sheriff's office." One of the men muttered something to Karen and she shot him a sharp glance before speaking again. "You're making this harder on yourself." "I'm making it harder for you to bluff your way onto my property," Ethan replied. "Big difference." The standoff lasted another 30 seconds before Karen signaled to her group. The men filed back into the SUVs, engines roaring to life. As the convoy pulled away, Ethan stayed by the gate, watching until the last vehicle disappeared down the road. By mid-afternoon, the incident had already become part of the lake's rumor mill. Several neighbors texted him, asking if the sheriff had really shown up. Ethan responded with a single sentence. "No, just a costume club meeting in my driveway." That night, Ethan called James, relaying the event in detail. "This is good," James said after a pause. "It's intimidation without legal grounds. If they try it again, we'll have even more leverage for harassment and abuse of authority claims." Ethan also sent the photos to the local reporter, along with a note. "If you're interested in a story about fake enforcement squads, I might have something for you." The reporter's reply came within minutes. "I'm very interested." As Ethan hung up, he glanced out toward the lake. The water had dropped another few inches. The board could play dress-up all they wanted. He still held the real power over the shoreline. And now, they'd tipped their hand in front of witnesses. The game was shifting faster than they realized. By Monday morning, Ethan's phone was lighting up. The reporter had done more than just write an article. She'd turned the fake enforcement stunt into a full photo spread on the front page of the local paper. The headline read, "Private. Board poses as special operations. Property owner calls. It costume party." Beneath it were 3 large photos. Karen at the gate holding her clipboard, the men in black cargo pants milling around, and a shot of the Special Operations Unit logo peeling slightly on the SUV door magnet. Ethan had to admit, the reporter had a knack for framing things. She didn't directly accuse them of breaking laws. She simply asked pointed questions. Who authorized the unit? Where were the real deputies? Why did the HOA need tactical gear for a water rights dispute? By noon, the phone calls had shifted from curious neighbors to strangers. Some congratulated him, others offered him advice, and a few from nearby towns asked if they could see the lowered lake for themselves. Karen's reaction came in the form of a public statement posted on the HOA website and taped to the community bulletin board by the marina. She claimed the board had been conducting a specialized safety assessment due to concerns over structural integrity and environmental stability. She didn't name Ethan directly, but the language was carefully aimed at making him look reckless. The problem was the photos told their own story. Tactical jackets and mock enforcement logos didn't scream environmental safety, they screamed overreach. That afternoon, Ethan visited the spillway again, turning the valves another few notches. The water level dropped visibly now, leaving a wide band of pale mud along the shore. Several pontoon boats sat stranded, their owners scrambling to push them into deeper water. When Karen saw him at the spillway, she marched right up. "You're destroying the shoreline," she snapped. "I'm maintaining my property," Ethan replied calmly. "It's well within my easement rights." "You'd know that if you'd read the original agreements instead of pretending they don't exist." Her jaw tightened. "You think you've won something here, but you've just made yourself the most unpopular man on this lake." "That's fine," Ethan said, locking the valves again. "I'm not here to win popularity contests. I'm here to get back what you destroyed." By evening, the reporter called again. "The county commissioners are asking questions," she said. "One of them told me off the record they've been uneasy with the HOA for a while. This incident may push them to review some of the board's actions." That was the moment Ethan realized the momentum had completely shifted. Before, he'd been on the defensive, just the guy whose lodge got torn down. Now he was the one, dictating the pace, and Karen was scrambling to contain the damage. 2 days later, the county sent official surveyors to inspect the lake infrastructure. They were polite, professional, and, most importantly, not under the HOA's control. Ethan made sure they had full access, and he watched from a distance as they examined both the spillway and the docks. Karen showed up halfway through the inspection, her voice sharp as she tried to assert that the board had already handled the matter. The lead surveyor simply nodded and said, "We'll file our report with the county directly." That exchange was witnessed by half a dozen boat owners and, of course, the reporter. That night, Ethan stood on his porch and looked across the still-lowered lake. The lights from houses shimmered on the surface, and in the distance he could see Karen's dock, its far end resting on the mud like a stranded pier to nowhere. The board had one card left to play. He could feel it. Whatever they did next, it would be desperate, and if he was ready, it would also be their undoing. Friday morning broke hot and windless, the lake lying still under a pale haze. Ethan was sipping coffee on his porch when he noticed a commotion near the marina. A large moving truck had pulled in, flanked by 2 pickup trucks loaded with lumber and cement bags. Men in neon vests were unloading scaffolding and work lights, moving fast, like they were on a deadline. At bow, the center of it all, stood Karen, clipboard in hand, barking orders. Ethan grabbed his binoculars. They were erecting a temporary barrier, an improvised dam, across a narrow section of the lake inlet. It wasn't official equipment. It looked hastily sourced, a jumble of sandbags, plywood, and sheet metal. It hit him immediately. She was trying to trap the remaining water on her side of the lake, cutting him and several other property owners off entirely. He called James. "She's building a barrier. Right now. No permits. No engineers, just throwing it together." "Perfect," James said. "Document everything. I'm calling the County Water Authority and the State Environmental Office. This won't just be an HOA violation. This will be an environmental infraction with serious fines." Ethan took photos from multiple angles, then walked down to the shoreline where he could be seen. Karen spotted him and strode over. "You forced this," she said sharply. "You've taken enough from us." "You mean the water you've been claiming as yours? The one I have legal rights to access?" Ethan asked. "And now you're blocking a navigable waterway without permits. That's bold." "It's necessary," she shot back. "It's reckless," Ethan corrected. Within the hour, 2 white county trucks arrived, followed by a vehicle marked with the state environmental seal. 3 officials got out, clipboards in hand, and began walking the site. One of them, a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, called out to Karen. "Ma'am, you need to stop work immediately. You have no authorization to alter this waterway." Karen tried to argue, waving her clipboard and insisting it was an emergency measure, but the official held up a hand. "If you don't cease construction right now, we will begin issuing citations and refer this to the state attorney's office. And trust me, the fines will not be small." The workers stepped back, unsure whether to keep going. Karen's voice rose, but her commands no longer carried weight. The men began loading the unused materials back onto the truck. The reporter showed up just in time to catch the exchange, her camera clicking rapidly. By the next morning, the headline read, "Unauthorized lake barrier halted by state officials. Board president under review." The article spelled out every detail, the lack of permits, the potential ecological damage, and the fact that several property owners, including Ethan, held clear easement rights the barrier would have violated. Within a week, the county announced a formal review of the HOA's management practices. The State Environmental Office issued a notice of violation against the board, with Karen's name listed as the responsible party. At the next board meeting, attendance was at an all-time high. Residents who had once been silent now spoke with sharp clarity, demanding new elections and transparency. Ethan didn't attend. He didn't need to. Word reached him later that Karen had resigned mid-meeting, slamming her binder shut and storming out without a word. 2 months later, the lake's level had stabilized. The lodge site was being rebuilt with insurance payouts and additional settlement funds, and the new board had formally apologized for the demolition. On a cool autumn evening, Ethan stood at the water's edge, the rebuilt spillway humming quietly in the distance. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the surface of the lake reflected the golden streaks of sunset. The fight had been long, noisy, and often absurd. But in the end, the water still ran where it was meant to, and the people who tried to seize control of it had found themselves stranded, just like Karen's dock, high and dry. Ethan took one last sip of coffee, smiled faintly, and walked back toward his porch. The lake was quiet now, and he intended to keep it that way.